Welcome to the Plant-Centered and Thriving podcast. I'm your host, Ashley Kitchens. Welcome back to the show. Y'all, I am really excited for our guest, and you better gear up because there are two plant-based dietitians on this podcast. So I'm about to interview Lauren. She is a registered dietitian, and she is based in Canada, specializing in plant-based nutrition with a master's in public health and nutrition. And she also has a specialization in women's health. And what's really exciting is kind of similar to what I do. She also runs a virtual practice where she helps those who are vegetarian, vegan, and those who just simply want to incorporate more plant-based foods into their everyday life and thrive on a plant-based diet. So she also has an online program, and all this information is going to be in the show notes. And you can find Lauren in so many different places, which we'll also put in the show notes. And she's going to talk more about that as well, because her Instagram, which I've been following her for a long time now, is incredible. So you'll definitely have to go check her out once this podcast ends. So welcome to the show, Lauren.
Thank you so much, Ashley. It's so nice to finally get to connect with you. I feel like I've been following you for forever. So I'm so happy to be on the podcast.
Yes, I know. I'm so glad that this worked out. And like I said, I've been following Lauren for a really long time. And I just feel really grateful that she was able to come onto this podcast and just share her wisdom, another plant-based dietitian's wisdom with you all. But before we even get into that, because we're going to talk about some common struggles that we see with the clients that we work with, but I really want Lauren to share her story and why she went plant-based vegan to begin with. So Lauren, kind of take us back to what life was like before and what led you into vegetarianism first, and then so on.
I went vegetarian, I think it's almost exactly 10 years ago in August. And I read a book called The Kind Diet by Alicia Silverstone, which I think a lot of people that I've talked to have kind of a similar story. I'm not necessarily saying all the information in the book is correct, but it definitely kind of pulled me to being vegetarian, mostly for the ethical reasons. So I've always loved animals. When I was younger, I wanted to be a veterinarian or I wanted to be a marine biologist. So everything that I loved growing up was animals and really focused around that. So when my eyes were kind of open to the ethical side of vegetarianism, I just couldn't look back. I felt like now that I had that information, I had to move forward with it. And I pretty much went vegetarian overnight. And before I went vegetarian, I really didn't know much about cooking at all. I, would eat like deli meat sandwiches for lunch. I would eat frozen pizzas for dinner. And this was right before I started my training to become a dietitian. So it kind of was perfect timing to inform that kind of transition. So I became a vegetarian. I was vegetarian for about 3 or 4 years, I would say, until I started to kind of feel like I wanted to transition to veganism. And it's funny because I remember so clearly when I first went vegetarian, I was like, okay, I'll be vegetarian, but I could never be vegan. I could never give up cheese. I don't know how people do that. People who are vegan are nuts. So I just I couldn't fathom it. So it was really a slow transition going to veganism. And the main reason again was for ethical reasons. So, once I found out more about factory farming for eggs and dairy and that sort of thing, I just felt like it was so intermingled that I couldn't really tease it apart between, the ethical side of being like vegetarian versus vegan. So I decided I want to transition to veganism, but it took me a very long time. I don't even really know the day that I was fully vegan because it took me so long that it was such a kind of gradual transition. And, it just started with only eating dairy or eggs when I was at restaurants or with friends and family, just slowly cutting that back more and more. And I'd say I've been vegan now for probably about 3 or 4 years. But again, like I said, I don't really know the full kind of timeline because it did take me so long.
it sounds like you didn't really put a whole lot of pressure on yourself to just go fully vegan. Like you allowed yourself to transition in a way that felt good for you. And I feel like a lot of times, like a lot of listeners or clients even that we work with feel like they have that pressure to like go overnight, but it sounds like the way you did it, it felt good. It worked out.
Oh, it did. You know what? I didn't even tell anyone that I was trying to go vegan. And there's so many different reasons for that and facets of that in terms of, I was a dietitian, I was becoming a dietitian, and I didn't want to feel judged. Even, 4 years ago, times were different in terms of what we knew about eating vegan or plant-based or vegetarian. And exactly like you said, I didn't want to put that pressure on myself. I didn't want to say I was vegan and then have a moment of weakness and my friends and family be calling me out and things like that. So that's something I even really encourage my clients to do if they don't feel comfortable to make the announcement that they want to go vegan or that they are vegan, to just take it at your own pace and keep that to yourself for as long as you feel like you want to.
Yeah, I think that's great advice. If we're out to eat with family and friends, unless they were secretly trying to go vegan, we don't have to justify, what we order at a restaurant. And two, I
Yeah.
really like what you said too. Like if, you're at a restaurant and you're like, oh no, I actually do want, the chicken sandwich or whatever it is, that's
Yeah.
okay. Like it's you kind of just figuring out how you can navigate this journey for yourself and make it sustainable long term.
Yeah, definitely. Absolutely. And especially when you're first trying to make this transition to a more plant based or vegan or vegetarian diet, there can be so many questions from friends and family. And sometimes it can make you feel a little bit defensive. And so maybe you don't know all of the information, maybe you don't know all of the evidence and the studies and things like that. So taking that at your own pace is totally okay. And as you go on, you'll probably become more confident.
Yes, yes, absolutely. That confidence piece just starts slowly building as you're going along. Absolutely.
Yeah.
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 I like what you said too when you went vegetarian, that you're like, I could never go vegan. Those people are crazy. Like, how could you give up cheese? And I feel like every single one of us has said that at one point in our life.
Yes, yes. I remember you made an Instagram post or a reel or something like that about that. And I was like, oh my gosh, this is so relatable. Like, this
Yep.
couldn't be more true for me.
Yeah, absolutely. So I'm actually really curious. When I became a dietitian in school, I wasn't vegetarian or vegan, and I really had
Right.
no interest in it at the time. I didn't know much about it. So what was it like for you kind of going through school, learning the things that you learned, and also too kind of, being vegetarian at the same time and maybe even like slowly transitioning to veganism?
Yeah, such a good question. So, to be honest, I don't have too much memory from going through school, university, just because I felt like it was a long time ago. But I do certainly remember there being some conversations around, eating meat, eating dairy, a lot of case studies that we would do in school talking about that. That would sometimes make me uncomfortable. Now, with that being said, I think people have this preconceived notion that when you are training to become a dietitian, it's like you are basically just promoting here in Canada, Canada's food guide or whatever the equivalent would be in the States, that is really focused on that meat and dairy, but that actually isn't true. There is a lot of flexibility. And I think the reason when I was going through school that maybe there was a little bit of emphasis on that was because it was a different time. And even though, it wasn't, such a long time ago, we have come so far, even in the past 5 to 10 years, that it's become a lot more acceptable. And when I was doing my dietetic internship here in Canada, and I think it's similar in the States, you have to do a year-long dietetic internship to become a dietitian. I remember being so nervous to tell the dietitians that I was working under, that I was vegan, because I just didn't want to be judged. And I think a lot of that was my own insecurity, because I do think that they were probably going to be a lot more accepting than I thought. But it was something that definitely took me some time for sure.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that's such a great point that times are changing. And I always keep an eye on the Canada Food Guide because I feel like you all are always sort of like a few steps ahead. I know I can't remember when it was, but you removed dairy off of it, if I remember
Yeah.
correctly, a while back. And I remember thinking, okay, come on, we're next, let's go. We'll get there eventually. But
Yeah.
But I really like the fact that you're very transparent about maybe feeling judgment from other people, because I know, I'm sure you see this in the clients that you work with, and I definitely see it. It's like that's a common question and a common struggle is like, well, what are people going to think? What are people going to say? Because they knew how I used to eat before, and now I'm like changing the way that I'm eating. Like, how are these relationships going to just fall off? What's that going to look like? What's my family going to think? So I
Yeah.
appreciate you being really transparent about that, because I think it's a real struggle.
It's such a struggle with so many of my clients that I actually added a completely new module into my online program that was just about eating plant based around those who aren't. And I wasn't sure how that would be received because my program is very educational and we're talking about the fundamentals of being plant based, like what your plate should look like, what nutrients you need to be focused on. And this one is a little bit more just conversational and subjective, but it was so well received because so many people struggle with it. And of course, that completely, like you said, makes sense. And when someone that you are around is used to you eating a certain way, it can be really hard for them, especially if they feel judged or attacked by your choices, which shouldn't be the case by any means, but it can sometimes happen.
Yeah. And
Mhm.
y'all, you listening, Lauren has a wonderful like self-paced fundamentals course when it comes to veganism and plant-based eating. And the link of that is in the show notes. So definitely check that out if that's something you're interested in, just to kind of go through something at your own pace and learn some of these fundamentals, especially if you're newer to plant-based or you're kind of maybe confused, or like you said, you maybe need help just navigating what to say to other people or how to eat around other people when you're transitioning to plant-based. So that's great.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Oh, thank you.
Yeah. So what are some other common struggles? We'll just kind of talk about like one or two common struggles that you see maybe with the clients that you work with as they're wanting to go more vegetarian or vegan or plant-based.
Yeah, such a good question. So, probably the number one thing I get asked, and I'm sure you get asked the exact same things, is how do you get your protein? And, I always laugh, but, it is such a good question because if you've grown up thinking that you can only get protein from meat and then maybe some dairy or eggs, of course, you're going to wonder about that. And, what I always say to people is as long as you are eating enough food for your body, so enough calories to fuel what you're doing and your activity level, as long as you're eating a good, varied plant based diet and including these protein rich plant based foods, protein is not going to be an issue for you. And, we always talk about what are the protein rich foods. So things like beans and lentils, other legumes, tofu, tempeh, edamame, soy milk, certain nuts and seeds can be added for, a boost in protein, that sort of thing. So that's always the first question. Another thing that we actually end up talking about a lot is supplements and like certain vitamins and minerals that we need to be focused on because I think people think that there is so many supplements that we need to be taking on a plant-based diet or a vegan diet, vegetarian diet to make it really well-rounded. The reality is that, of course, supplementation is very individual, but there's only a couple that we like need to really be focused on for the general population, with vitamin B12 being the number one in terms of making sure you're getting enough of. So I would say those are kind of the two biggest questions that I get in terms of like, what should I be eating for protein? What should I be doing for supplements? And then even what should I be eating? And I know that you kind of talk about this a lot, like it's not the standard meat and potatoes and vegetables. So what should I be eating then if I'm taking those things away?
Yeah. And it's hard to go from like most of us were raised with seeing like our plate formed that way. It's like it's very easy
Yep.
to identify where the protein is. Okay, the meat is on my plate. This is where I'm getting it. And then you
Yeah.
look at a plant-based plate and you're like, well, wait a sec, where is the protein? Like, because everything looks the same kind of. So I think, yeah, that's a great point. And like you said, and just to reiterate what Lauren said, because it's something that I also talk about, and this again, coming from two plant-based dietitians, as long as you're getting enough calories to fuel whatever it is that you're doing and eating a variety of plant-based foods, especially the protein dense ones as well, like you're good to go. Like it's not something that you need to worry about, which is reassuring.
Yeah. Exactly. It really is.
Yeah. And the same with the supplement thing too. I think just getting advice from someone who, like a plant-based dietitian or a plant-based doctor, someone who can really give you that evidence-based information on what it is that you need when it comes to
Yeah.
supplementation is really helpful too, because there's so much misinformation and just information out there in general. It can be kind of confusing on, okay, well, do I need 10 supplements or maybe do I just need two?
Yep, definitely. And, that can save you so much money too, which I know maybe isn't
Mhm.
something that we really commonly talk about, but that is a really big concern for a lot of people is this going to cost me a ton of money to follow this way of eating? And so having that reassurance that, of course, as dietitians, we always want to give the disclaimer, everyone is individual, so definitely work with a dietitian to see what your specific needs are. But for the general population, there aren't a ton of supplements that you will need to be taking, and therefore not a ton of money that you'll need to be spending on that.
Yes. Yeah, absolutely. And Lauren's doing something really cool with her reels right now, which you'll have to scroll back to see, but just things that we really don't need to purchase or that might be sort of a waste of money. They might look, sexy on the shelf, but are things that we just really don't need and can make this way of eating a lot more expensive than what it actually needs to be.
Yes, exactly.
Yeah. Ah, so much good stuff. Well, thank you, Lauren, for being here and just sharing your wisdom with everybody. I really do appreciate it.
Oh my gosh, of course. Thank you so much for having me. It's been such a pleasure chatting with you and connecting with you.
Yeah, absolutely. Okay, y'all, at the very least, you have to go to Lauren's Instagram. It's tasting to thrive _RD. Definitely go check her out. She puts up some beautiful food and recipes. And then also she has just some really great educational resources, reels, and so much other great stuff. So definitely check that out and anything else that you find interesting in the show notes. But again, Lauren, thank you so much for being here.
Oh my gosh, thank you so much for having me.
Until next time, keep thriving.